At 18, Nora Whitaker had everything she owned stuffed into one worn duffel bag. A dead car on the side of a coastal Maine road and exactly $47 left to her name. She had just aged out of foster care, had no family waiting for her, and nowhere to sleep once the cold came. Then, buried among the few papers her mother had left behind, Nora found something she never knew existed. A deed to Blackwater Point Lighthouse, an abandoned lighthouse at the edge of a dying seaside town. The place had been forgotten for nearly 30 years. Its windows were broken, its roof leaked, its stairs were rotting, and everyone in Greyhaven told her the same thing. Sell the land, take whatever money you can get, and walk away. When Nora said she planned to fix the keeper's quarters and live there instead, people laughed. Even the old boat repairman who lived nearby told her she wouldn't last until the first winter storm. But Nora had spent most of her life being sent from one temporary home to another, and for the first time, this ruined place belonged to her. So with almost no money and nothing left to lose, she began repairing it herself. Then, while pulling a rotten board from beneath the lighthouse stairs, Nora heard something fall inside a space that wasn't supposed to be there. She pried the boards apart and reached into the darkness. Her fingers touched a metal box wrapped in oilcloth. Inside was a journal dated 1952, bearing the name Captain Elias Whitaker, the great-grandfather Nora had never known existed. But it wasn't his name that made her hands tremble. It was the sentence written across the first page. Because if what Elias had written was true, then for more than half a century everyone in Greyhaven had believed a lie. And what Nora would inevitably discover hidden behind the lighthouse's forgotten second light would explain why one man allowed an entire town to remember him as a coward. But before we go back to the day Nora arrived in Greyhaven with only $47, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there right now. Whether you're starting your morning, taking a quiet afternoon break, or listening late at night, I hope the hours ahead bring you something good. And if you enjoy stories about ordinary people uncovering extraordinary pieces of the past, subscribe to the channel and stay with me, because Nora thought she had inherited nothing more than a broken lighthouse. But beneath those old stairs, she had just opened the first page of a secret someone had protected for 56 years. The tow truck disappeared around the bend, leaving Nora Whitaker alone beside a dead Chevrolet, one worn duffel bag, and a road that smelled of salt and wet pine. She opened her wallet beneath the gray October sky and counted twice. $47. That was everything. At 18, Nora had officially aged out of foster care 3 weeks earlier. Carrying her clothes, her mother's old papers, and the habit of never unpacking completely. She had planned to drive north until she found work. Instead, the Chevrolet had coughed twice outside Greyhaven, Maine, and died. The mechanic's estimate was more money than she had seen in months. Nora sat on the hood and stared toward the distant ocean. Then she remembered the envelope in her mother's papers. She pulled it from her duffel. Blackwater Point Lighthouse was printed across an old property deed, followed by her mother's name. Nora had always assumed it was worthless paperwork. Now it was the closest thing she had to an address. By afternoon, she was walking the coastal road with her bag cutting into her shoulder. Blackwater Point appeared beyond a stand of wind-bent spruce, a weather-beaten white tower attached to a small keeper's house, both facing the Atlantic, as though they had spent decades losing an argument with the sea. Several windows were broken. Paint peeled from the siding. One gutter hung loose, tapping whenever the wind caught it. Nora stopped at the rusted gate. "Well," she whispered, "you're still standing." Barely. The front door resisted until she shoved it with her shoulder. Inside, the keeper's quarters smelled of damp wood and dust. Rain had stained the ceiling. A section of plaster had fallen beside an old stove. She tested the floor before trusting her weight to it. "You planning to stay in there?" Nora spun around. An older man stood outside, broad-shouldered despite his age, wearing a faded work jacket. "It's mine," she said. "That wasn't my question." He introduced himself as Thomas Bell and said he repaired boats down the road. His eyes moved from Nora to the duffel bag, then to the broken windows. "Blackwater's been empty close to 30 years. Can the house be fixed?" "Anything can be fixed if you've got enough money." Nora almost laughed. "What if I don't?" Thomas studied her. "Sell the land. Forget the tower." Nora looked back into the ruined keeper's quarters. She had spent years sleeping in rooms decorated by other people, learning which drawers she was allowed to use and how quickly her belongings could be packed when somebody decided she had to leave. This place was rotten, cold, and possibly unsafe. But the deed had her mother's name on it. Now it had passed to Nora. No caseworker could move her from it. "I just need one room dry enough to sleep in." Thomas's expression softened only slightly. "Roof leaks over the bedroom, windows gone in the kitchen. Stairs in the tower are worse, so I start with the roof." "You know roofing?" "No." He gave a short, disbelieving laugh. "Then maybe start by surviving the ladder." Nora expected him to leave, but Thomas walked inside and showed her where the floorboards were weakest. He pointed out a shutoff valve, an old hand pump, and a section of ceiling she should not stand beneath. Before going, he paused beside the doorway. "Storms out here don't care who owns the deed. Neither do landlords." Nora replied. That earned the smallest hint of a smile. After he left, Nora found a broom and cleared enough debris to make a sleeping space. She covered the broken kitchen window with an old board and placed a bucket beneath the worst leak. Near sunset, she inspected the lighthouse stairs. The wooden steps spiraled upward into darkness. On the lowest post, almost hidden beneath layers of peeling paint, someone had carved a symbol. 2 small lanterns side by side. Nora rubbed dirt from the grooves. She looked toward the tower above her. 1 lighthouse, 2 lights. She took out her phone, but there was barely a signal, and the battery was nearly dead. The question would have to wait. Darkness arrived quickly. Nora ate crackers for dinner and spread her sleeping bag across the driest section of floor. Wind pushed against the walls. Rain began after midnight, tapping the boarded window and dripping steadily into her bucket. She lay awake listening. It should have felt miserable. Instead, staring at the cracked ceiling, Nora felt something unfamiliar. Nobody could tell her she had overstayed. Nobody could move her bag into a hallway. Nobody could say there wasn't room anymore. The place might fall apart around her, but tonight, the door was hers to lock. In the morning, she started with the damaged boards beneath the tower stairs. One was black with rot. Nora wedged an old pry bar beneath it and pulled. The nail screamed free. She pulled again. The board cracked upward and something beneath it dropped with a sharp metallic clang. Nora froze. She looked into the narrow darkness under the floor. There shouldn't have been enough space beneath those boards for anything to fall. She lowered herself to her knees, pushed aside the broken plank, and listened. Somewhere below her, hidden beneath the lighthouse stairs, something had just moved. Nora stayed on her knees, staring into the black gap beneath the broken floorboard. She reached down, but her fingertips met only cold dirt. Whatever had fallen was deeper than she expected. She found a flashlight in her duffel bag and returned to the stairs. The beam revealed a narrow cavity between the foundation stones, and at the bottom, partly buried in dust, was the corner of something metal. She tried the pry bar, widening the opening until another board split. "You're going to bring the whole staircase down." Nora jerked around. A young man stood in the doorway carrying a toolbox. "Thomas sent me," he said. "Daniel Mercer. He figured you'd either need tools or an ambulance." Nora glanced at the hole. "Tools first." Daniel crouched beside her. Together they removed the damaged board without disturbing the stair support. Daniel reached into the cavity and pulled out a rectangular tin box wrapped in stiff, dark oilcloth. "That wasn't put there by accident," he said. Nora wiped dirt from the cloth. Her first thought was money, followed immediately by embarrassment for having thought it. The box was rusted along one edge. Daniel worked the latch with a screwdriver until it snapped open. Inside lay a leather-bound journal. Nora lifted it carefully. The leather was cracked, and several pages had swollen from moisture. On the first page, written in faded ink, were 4 words: Captain Elias Whitaker, 1952. Nora read the surname again. "Whitaker?" Daniel asked. "That's my name." She searched her memory for anything her mother had ever said about an Elias. There was nothing. Her mother had rarely spoken about family at all. Nora closed the journal. Suddenly, it felt less like something she had found and more like something that had been waiting. Daniel suggested the Greyhaven Library by early afternoon. Nora had walked into town with the journal protected inside a plastic grocery bag. The library occupied a brick building near the harbor. Margaret Hale, a silver-haired woman with reading glasses hanging from a chain, listened while Nora explained where the journal had been found. At the name Elias Whitaker, Margaret's expression changed. "You're related to him?" "Apparently." Margaret led her downstairs to the local archive. She opened drawers of microfilm and old newspaper indexes, moving with the confidence of someone who had spent decades remembering where everyone else's history was stored. "Blackwater Point," Margaret murmured. 1952. A few minutes later, an old newspaper page appeared on the reader. Nora leaned closer. The headline filled the screen. "Local captain refused rescue as 31 lost at sea." Beneath it was a grainy photograph of a dark-haired man standing beside a fishing vessel. Captain Elias Whitaker. Nora read the article twice. During a violent storm, a passenger vessel had struck rocks near Blackwater Point. According to the report, Elias had seen distress signals but refused to take his boat out. 31 people were reported dead. "He just left them there?" Nora asked. Margaret did not answer immediately. "That's what this article says." Nora stared at Elias's photograph. Finding an ancestor should have meant discovering some missing piece of herself. Instead, she had found a man the town remembered for abandoning drowning people. She pushed away from the machine. "Maybe the journal should have stayed under the stairs." Margaret looked at her. "Old newspapers tell us what people believed happened. That's not always the same as knowing what happened." Nora returned to Blackwater Point before dusk. Daniel had gone, but Thomas was repairing a section of the boarded kitchen window. Nora placed the journal on the table. "Did you ever hear of Elias Whitaker?" Thomas's hammer stopped for half a second, then continued. "Why?" "Because apparently he was my great-grandfather." Thomas lowered the hammer. His face gave her nothing. "Where'd you hear that, Nora?" tapped the journal. "Under the stairs." Thomas looked at it but did not touch it. "Some things survive because nobody goes looking for them." "That's not an answer." "Wasn't meant to be." He finished securing the board and left before Nora could stop him. That night, rain returned. Nora sat inside her sleeping bag with the journal across her knees. Several pages were unreadable. Their ink dissolved into brown shadows. Others remained surprisingly clear. Elias wrote about wind direction, repairs, fuel, tides, and an approaching storm. Nothing sounded like the words of a coward. Nora kept reading. Near the middle of a damaged page, she found a sentence written more heavily than the rest. "If the harbor light fails, we will use the second." Nora read it again. The second. Her mind returned to the symbol carved into the stair post, 2 lanterns side by side. She looked toward the dark tower. Blackwater Point had 1 lighthouse, 1 lantern room. So what second light was Elias talking about the next morning? Thomas returned carrying scrap lumber. Nora met him outside with the journal already in her hand. What was the second light? Thomas stopped. I don't know. You reacted when I said Elias's name. Thomas set the lumber down. Everyone in Greyhaven knew that name when I was young. The newspaper says he watched people drown. Thomas looked toward the ocean for a long moment. Everyone in Greyhaven knew what your great-grandfather did. Nora tightened her grip on the journal. Then tell me. Thomas turned back to her, his expression suddenly grave. But that newspaper never printed the whole story. Thomas did not speak until he had carried the scrap lumber inside and set it beside the kitchen wall. Nora followed him, the journal pressed against her chest. What whole story? She asked. Thomas looked toward the tower stairs. When I was a boy, Elias Whitaker was the name people used when they wanted to talk about cowardice without saying the word. He pulled out a chair and sat. The storm hit in November of 1952. A passenger vessel got caught near Blackwater Point and struck the rocks. People in town said Elias saw the distress signals from shore, said he had a boat capable of going out, but wouldn't risk it. 31 people died. That's what they printed. Nora placed the journal on the table. Did you believe it? Thomas rubbed a thumb across a scar on his knuckle. I was a child. Children believe what everybody around them repeats, he explained, that after the wreck, Elias stopped appearing in town. Shopkeepers refused him service. Families crossed the street when they saw him. Eventually, people simply stopped seeing him at all. So he ran away, Nora asked. That's what people assumed. The answer left an unpleasant weight in her stomach. She had spent years wondering why her mother never spoke about family. Now she wondered whether shame had been part of the silence. Thomas stood. Stories get harder with age, Nora. Doesn't mean they get truer. He returned to repairing the window, signaling the conversation was finished. Nora opened the journal again. The damaged pages forced her to move slowly. Elias recorded ordinary details with almost obsessive care. Wind speed, tides, equipment, fuel. Then, as the date of the wreck approached, his entries changed. November 16th, storm warning received. November 17th, checked ropes and lanterns. November 18th, blankets moved to the lower room. Fuel cans filled before dark. Nora stopped. Those weren't the preparations of someone planning to stay safely indoors. She found Thomas outside cutting a board. Why would a man who refused to rescue anyone prepare ropes, blankets, lanterns, and fuel? Thomas lowered the saw. I don't know. You keep saying that because I don't know what Elias did. I know what people said. Those aren't the same thing. Thomas looked at her, and Nora realized she had repeated Margaret's point without meaning to. That afternoon, she returned to the library. Margaret was sorting folders when Nora arrived. I need records from the wreck, Nora said. Margaret glanced at the journal under her arm. You kept reading, unfortunately. Margaret smiled faintly and led her downstairs. They began with archived maritime reports. The Coast Guard material was thin weather observations, reported casualties, vessel information, and a summary of rescue activity. Nora compared dates against Elias's entries. Here, she pointed. He wrote that he checked rescue ropes on the 17th. The report doesn't mention him. Exactly. Margaret turned another page. Nora noticed the numbering first. Page 12 was followed by page 14. Where's 13? Margaret checked the folder, then the catalog record. Nothing. Could have been lost when the archive was transferred. Convenient, Don't decide what missing evidence means before you know why it's missing. Nora leaned back, frustrated. So I have a newspaper calling him a coward, a journal saying he prepared for a rescue, and a report with a missing page. None of that proves anything. No, Margaret said, but it gives you better questions. For the first time since arriving in Greyhaven, Nora felt someone was treating her questions seriously instead of waiting for her to give up. She turned back to the journal. Several entries around the storm were stained beyond recognition. She held one page toward the desk lamp and could make out fragments of names. These might be people. Margaret brought over a magnifying glass. Together, they deciphered 4 entries written beneath a list of equipment: Samuel Bell, Joseph Pike, Henry Cole, Martin Avery. Beside them, Elias had written, "Confirmed." Nora copied the names. Margaret searched the archive index. Joseph Pike had died in 1978. Henry Cole in 1989. Martin Avery in 1996. And Samuel Bell, Nora asked. Margaret typed, then stopped. She turned the screen toward Nora. An obituary appeared from years earlier. Samuel Bell had worked as a fisherman in Greyhaven for most of his life. Nora skimmed the surviving family section. Her eyes caught on one line. Son Thomas Bell. Nora stared at it. Thomas's father, Margaret, nodded. Suddenly, Thomas's silences felt different. Nora remembered the way his hammer had stopped when she first said Elias's name. She remembered his careful wording. I know what people said. By sunset, she was walking quickly back toward Blackwater Point. The copied journal entry folded inside her pocket. Thomas's truck was parked beside the keeper's house. She found him replacing another rotten board near the kitchen window. He glanced over. Library again. Nora pulled out the paper. You told me everyone knew what Elias did. Thomas went still. I told you what the town believed. Then you told me you didn't know what really happened. She unfolded the paper. Elias listed 4 men before the storm. Joseph Pike, Henry Cole, Martin Avery. Thomas's face changed before she said the final name. Nora stepped closer. Samuel Bell. The hammer lowered slowly to Thomas's side. Your father. Wind moved through the grass between them. Thomas looked toward the lighthouse, and for several seconds he seemed much older than 67. Nora held up the journal. Your father was with Elias, wasn't he? Thomas said nothing. He didn't have to. Nora finally understood why he had recognized the name, why he had warned her that the newspaper hadn't told the whole story, and why every answer stopped just short of the truth. The only living connection she had found to the night Elias Whitaker became Greyhaven's most hated man had been standing beside her lighthouse from the beginning. Thomas stared at the folded paper in Nora's hand, then turned away from her toward the gray Atlantic. For a long time, the only sound was the wind pressing through the grass around Blackwater Point. You should have told me, Nora said. I told you what I knew. No, you told me what everyone else believed. Thomas exhaled slowly. Because that's all I had that I trusted. Nora stepped closer. Your father was there? Thomas nodded once. Samuel Bell was with Elias that night. The admission landed harder than Nora expected. Then he knew Elias didn't just stand here and watch people drown. Maybe my father never told me the whole thing. Thomas's voice sharpened. He didn't sit me down and explain the storm. He gave me pieces. A sentence here, a warning there. Mostly, he told me never to repeat what little I heard. Nora felt anger rise in her chest. Why I asked him that until the day he died. Thomas walked to his truck, opened the passenger door, and reached behind the seat. When he returned, he carried a small wooden box scarred by years of use. Inside was an old brass compass. He placed it in Nora's palm. This belonged to him. The glass was scratched, but the needle still moved. Nora turned it over. On the back, 2 markings had been carved by hand. 23 BP? What does it mean? Thomas shook his head. He never explained. 23, that was my guess. Nora thought of the newspaper. 31 dead, 11 survivors listed in the archive. If 23 meant people, something did not fit. The official report says 11 survived. I know. Then why would your father carry 23 on his compass? Thomas looked toward the lighthouse. That's one of the questions I stopped asking. Nora closed her fingers around the compass. I'm not going to stop. Thomas studied her face, perhaps deciding whether that was courage or stubbornness. Then don't assume every answer will make you feel better. By afternoon, Daniel arrived with a coil of wire and a battered toolbox. Nora showed him the compass while Thomas worked outside. 23BP, Daniel read. Blackwater Point. That's what I'm thinking. They returned to the lighthouse tower to examine the old electrical system. Nora wanted to understand Elias's reference to the second light. Most of the visible wiring was dead, brittle, or cut. Daniel removed a rusted metal cover from the wall and traced the lines upward toward the lantern room. Main feed, he said. Then he frowned. This one's different. A thinner, older cable disappeared through the stone wall instead of climbing the tower. Nora aimed her flashlight. Where does it go? Not where the plans say. You've seen plans? Thomas had an old maintenance sketch in his shop. Daniel crouched and followed the cable along the baseboard. It vanished behind a large wooden cabinet fixed against the seaward wall. Nora felt that familiar pull of curiosity. Another thing that did not belong where it was. Before they could move the cabinet, the sound of tires came from outside. A dark sedan stopped beside Thomas's truck. A man in a clean wool coat stepped out. He was in his late 50s, silver at the temples, carrying himself with the easy confidence of someone used to being recognized. Nora Whitaker? He asked. Yes. Charles Vane? He extended a hand. I own several properties along the coast. Nora shook it cautiously. Charles looked past her at the tower. I heard Blackwater Point had changed hands. It didn't change hands. I inherited it. Of course. His smile remained polite, which is why I came to make you an offer. He named a price that made Nora forget the cold for a second. It was more money than she had ever possessed. Enough to repair her car, enough for rent, enough to leave Greyhaven and start over somewhere easier. Charles glanced at the broken windows. This place will consume whatever you put into it. Roof, wiring, foundation, salt damage. You're 18. You don't need a ruin tying you down. The words struck close to every practical fear she had been trying not to name. Nora looked at the keeper's house, at the boarded window Thomas had repaired, at the tower where she had slept her first night without wondering who might tell her to leave. I'm not selling. Charles's expression barely changed. You should think about it. I just did. He gave a small nod. Offers don't always stay this generous. When his car disappeared down the road, Daniel leaned against the doorway. That was a lot of money. I know. You sure Nora looked at the lighthouse? No. Then she picked up the pry bar? Helped me move the cabinet. They worked it loose from the wall inch by inch. Dust spilled from behind it. The hidden electrical cable continued downward, then vanished beside a narrow section of wooden paneling. Daniel knocked against the boards. The sound changed halfway across. Hollow. Nora wedged the pry bar into a seam. One panel shifted. Behind it was not open stone, but the outline of a narrow door that had been boarded over and painted to match the wall. At its center, almost invisible beneath grime, was the same carving Nora had found on the stair post. 2 small lanterns, side by side. Daniel stared at it. Nora slowly took Samuel Bell's compass from her pocket and looked again at the number carved into its back. 23. She touched the symbol on the hidden door. Somewhere behind it, the old wire continued into darkness. Nora and Daniel stood before the concealed door long after the sound of Charles Vane's car had vanished down the road. The two-lantern symbol seemed darker now that she knew it had been deliberately hidden. Daniel tested the boards framing the door. Whatever's behind this hasn't been opened in a long time. Then we open it. He gave her a sideways look. You always say that like the building isn't actively trying to collapse on us. They removed the worked trim carefully, working around the old electrical cable. The lock had rusted solid, so Daniel drove a screwdriver beneath the latch while Nora held the flashlight. On the third attempt, the metal snapped. The door moved only an inch before scraping against the floor. Together they forced it wider. A cold, salt-heavy smell drifted out. The space beyond was small. Built into the seaward side of the lighthouse, dust covered a narrow workbench and shelves. Against the far wall stood a metal frame supporting a circular lamp no larger than a dinner plate, with a reflector behind it and an adjustable bracket beneath. Daniel stepped toward it slowly. Well, he said, there's your second light. Nora forgot to breathe for a moment. The journal had not been describing a metaphor. The old wire they had traced entered the room and connected directly to the lamp. Daniel turned the bracket with both hands. It resisted, then shifted toward a narrow shutter in the wall. He opened the shutter. Through it, Nora could see the ocean below and a channel between black reefs extending away from Blackwater Point. It points down, she said, not out to sea. Daniel nodded. Maine Lighthouse warns ships away from the coast. This looks like it was meant to show somebody a path through those rocks. Nora thought of Elias's words. If the harbor light fails, we will use the second. She took the journal from her bag and found the entry again. For the first time, the sentence had a physical shape in front of her. So he planned to use this during the storm. Looks that way. But why isn't it on the maintenance plan? Daniel shook his head. Maybe it was added later. Nora searched the shelves. Most held corroded tools, lantern parts, and empty fuel tins. Under the workbench, she found a folded canvas bundle that crumbled when she touched it. Beside it lay something faded orange. She pulled it free. A child's life jacket. The fabric had hardened with age, and one strap had broken. But someone had written a name inside the collar in black ink. Ana Ferreira. Nora read it aloud. Daniel leaned closer. Passenger, maybe. She carried the jacket directly to Margaret that afternoon. The librarian retrieved the official passenger list from the Blackwater wreck and ran her fingers slowly down the names. Nora waited. Margaret checked it again. No Ana Ferreira. Maybe the spelling is different. They searched variations. Nothing. Could the jacket have nothing to do with the wreck? Margaret asked. Nora placed Elias's journal beside it. It was hidden in the room with the second light. Margaret studied the name. Then we looked somewhere else. They searched newspaper indexes, census entries, and old local directories. The work stretched through the afternoon. Nora began to think the name might lead nowhere. Then Margaret stopped scrolling. Here, a later Massachusetts directory listed an Ana Ferreira with an age that would have made her a child in 1952. Another record showed the same woman decades later. Nora's pulse quickened. So she existed? Yes. But she wasn't on the ship. Margaret leaned back. At least not according to the official manifest. Nora looked again at the life jacket. One question had been answered. The second light existed. Another had immediately replaced it. Why would a child whose name appeared nowhere on the passenger list leave her life jacket inside Elias Whitaker's hidden room? When Nora returned to Blackwater Point, Daniel was patching a leak near the tower entrance. Clouds had thickened over the Atlantic. "Weather service says another storm's coming," he told her. "How bad?" "Bad enough that the roof matters more than old wiring for a day or two." Nora looked toward the keeper's quarters. The temporary repairs Thomas had made would not hold forever. She hated the timing. But Daniel was right. They spent the remaining daylight covering the weakest section of roof with salvaged material Thomas had left. Nora slipped once on the damp ladder, and Daniel caught her wrist. "You know," he said, "most people move into a place after they fix it. Most people have options." He looked down at the lighthouse. "You're fixing it like you plan to stay." Nora tightened a nail into the patch. "I'm fixing it because I don't want rain on my face while I sleep." "Sure." She expected herself to argue, but she didn't. That unsettled her more than the storm. After dark, she sat at the kitchen table with the journal, Samuel Bell's compass, and the child's life jacket beside her. The building creaked under rising wind. She opened the newspaper archive notes Margaret had copied for her and searched Anna's name again. Near the bottom of the page was a reference Margaret had circled before Nora left, an obituary published years later in Massachusetts. Nora read the brief paragraph once, then again. Anna Ferreira had married, raised 3 children, and worked for decades as a seamstress. The final lines described her childhood emigration to America. Nora's eyes stopped on one sentence. She survived the Blackwater storm as a child. Nora read Anna Ferreira's obituary again before dawn, then carried the clipping to Margaret as soon as the library opened. "She survived the Blackwater storm," Nora said, "but she wasn't on the manifest." Margaret adjusted her glasses and studied the page. "Then the obituary gives us a family connection within an hour." They had traced Anna's records far enough to find the name of her daughter, Elena Ferreira, now living in Massachusetts. Nora stared at the phone number Margaret had written down. "What am I supposed to say? The truth? Which part? Start with the life jacket." Nora called from the archive desk. A woman answered on the 4th ring. Nora introduced herself, explained Blackwater Point, the journal, and the name inside the child's life jacket. Silence followed. Then Elena asked, "Did you say Elias Whitaker?" Nora sat straighter. "Yes." Elena's voice changed. "My mother knew that name." Nora gripped the receiver. "How?" "She said he saved her life." Nora looked at Margaret, who had gone completely still. Elena explained that Anna had been 7 years old during the storm. She rarely spoke about the wreck in detail, but whenever she did, she remembered freezing water, darkness, and a man carrying her from a small boat. She called him Captain Elias. "Did she ever say why her name wasn't on the passenger list?" Nora asked. "No. She only said there were things people were afraid to talk about back then." Nora's pulse quickened. "Did she ever mention a second light?" Elena was quiet for several seconds. She talked about a low light near the rocks. She said they followed it through the storm. Nora closed her eyes. Elias had not simply prepared for a rescue. Someone he rescued remembered him. "I have something else," Elena said. "A photograph. My mother kept it in a box with old family papers. 2 days later, an envelope arrived at the library. Nora opened it with Margaret beside her. The photograph was creased and faded. 4 men stood near a row of exhausted-looking adults and children wrapped in blankets. Nora recognized Elias from the newspaper photograph. Beside him stood a younger Samuel Bell. On the back, written in blue ink, were 6 words. 23 came through the light. Nora felt the room narrow around her. 23! She took Samuel's compass from her pocket and placed it beside the photograph. 23 BP, Margaret whispered. Blackwater Point, Nora nodded. 23 people. If the photograph is genuine, you think it isn't. I think we prove everything we can. They compared faces, dates, paper type, and names. Nothing contradicted the photograph. It did not explain why the official report listed only 11 survivors, but it proved the number 23 had existed outside Samuel Bell's compass. That evening, Nora returned to the journal. Several pages near the storm date contained references to initials she had previously ignored. One appeared more than once. A.V. In one entry, Elias wrote, A.V. knows the count is wrong. In another, A.V. will not want questions asked. Nora copied the lines into her notebook. The initials bothered her. The next morning, Charles Vane arrived at Blackwater Point while Nora and Daniel were replacing a loose section of exterior trim. He looked at the tools, then at Nora. "You're still here." "You sound surprised." "I'm surprised anyone chooses this much work." Nora wiped her hands on her jeans. "Did your family know Elias Whitaker Charles's face remained controlled? Greyhaven is small. Everyone knew the Whitakers. What about Arthur Vane?" That produced the smallest pause. "My grandfather." Nora took the journal from the table inside and opened to the copied entries. "Elias mentioned someone with those initials." Charles did not look at the page. "Initials aren't evidence. I didn't say they were. Then be careful what you make them into." His tone was not angry, but it was firmer now. Old family stories can become accusations very quickly, and old newspapers can become lies if everyone repeats them long enough. Charles studied her for a moment. "You're 18, Nora. You've known this town for days. Don't mistake a few scraps of paper for understanding everything that happened here." "Then help me understand." He shook his head. "I came to repeat my offer, nothing more. I'm still not selling." Charles left without another word. Daniel watched the sedan disappear. "That went well. He knew the name Arthur before I explained anything." "It was his grandfather." "Exactly." Nora knew suspicion was not proof, but the journal had placed A.V. close to the mystery, and Charles had given her no reason to stop asking. Later, while Daniel worked on the roof patch, he found Nora sitting beside the second light with the photograph in her hands. "That Anna?" he asked. Nora pointed to the group. "One of them might be—" Daniel studied the image. 23 people. Nora nodded. "My great-grandfather saved them." The words came out before she could stop them. "My great-grandfather, not Elias, not the man in the newspaper." Something warmer and more painful moved through her chest. She had spent most of her life avoiding the idea of family because family was usually another word for absence. Now a man dead for decades was becoming real to her through ink, rusted equipment, and people who remembered his hands pulling them from the sea. Margaret called before sunset. "Come to the library," she said. "I found something in the shipping records." Nora walked into town with the journal and photograph tucked beneath her coat. Margaret had spread 2 documents across the archive table. "This is the passenger manifest that appears in the official file," she said. "And this is an earlier carbon copy from the harbor office." Nora compared them. At first, they looked identical. Then she saw the differences spacing. Overwritten numbers, lines that did not match. Margaret pointed to several entries near the bottom. This section was altered. After the wreck. "That's what it looks like." Nora stared at the page. 11 official survivors. 23 people in the photograph. Anna Ferreira absent entirely. Elias writing that A.V. knew the count was wrong. Margaret tapped the carbon copy once. Someone changed the manifest. Nora stood over the two passenger manifests until the names blurred together. The earlier carbon copy from the harbor office contained uneven spacing and handwritten corrections, while the version filed after the wreck looked cleaner, as if someone had wanted the record to appear settled. "How many names are different?" she asked. Margaret ran a pencil down the columns. "Enough that I wouldn't call it a clerical mistake." Nora pulled the photograph from her bag and placed it beside the manifests. 23 came through the light. "Arthur Vane owned the ship," she said. Margaret nodded. They had confirmed it that morning through maritime registration records. The vessel had been operated by a company controlled by Arthur Vane, Charles's grandfather. "If more people were aboard than he reported," Nora said, "he had a reason to hide them, a possible reason." Margaret corrected gently. "We still need Elias's reason for keeping quiet." That question followed Nora back to Blackwater Point. She spent the afternoon reading the journal beside the weak light of the keeper's kitchen while wind pushed rain against the boarded window. Several passages near the wreck were damaged, but enough remained to change the shape of the story. Elias wrote that the official count was wrong. He wrote that some passengers had boarded without appearing on the proper list. He wrote that Arthur Vane knew exactly how many people had been taken aboard because payment had been collected from them anyway. Nora read one sentence 3 times. They paid for passage, but not for the protection of having their names written down. She felt sick. These were not mysterious missing numbers. They were families, children, people like Anna Ferreira. When Thomas arrived with a roll of roofing material, Nora met him at the door. Arthur Vane was carrying passengers who weren't on the manifest. Thomas looked tired rather than surprised. "That's what it sounds like. Your father knew. I think he did. And he still said nothing." Thomas set the roofing roll against the wall. "You want an answer I should have gotten from him myself." Nora opened the journal to an entry dated days after the wreck. Elias's handwriting was uneven there, darker in places as though he had pressed too hard. If the names are given, they will ask how they came. Who brought them? Who vouched for them? Families already frightened will be separated before they are allowed to begin. Nora looked up. He wasn't only hiding what Arthur did. Thomas read the passage silently. His jaw tightened. He was protecting the survivors. Nora felt the anger she had carried toward Elias since seeing the newspaper headline shift into something heavier. He let them call him a coward. Thomas sat at the table. There were different fears then, different consequences. Men like my father didn't talk about immigration officers or paperwork around children. But I remember him saying some people from that storm couldn't afford questions. He stared at Samuel's compass in Nora's hand. I thought he meant shame. He meant survival. Thomas nodded slowly. Maybe. Nora closed the journal. Why did Samuel stay quiet too? Thomas's eyes remained on the compass. Because Elias asked him to. And because my father believed keeping those families safe mattered more than clearing his own name? His voice roughened. He regretted something about that choice for the rest of his life. I never knew whether he regretted the silence or the fact that Elias carried most of the blame. For once, Nora did not press him. Thomas had spent decades living beside a story his father refused to finish. She understood something about unfinished families. That evening, the storm worsened. Water found a new path through the keeper's roof and began dripping near Nora's sleeping area. Daniel arrived before dark to help secure the loose patch, but the wind made climbing unsafe. We can't fix it properly tonight, he said. We can keep it from getting worse. They dragged buckets beneath the leaks, covered Nora's few belongings with plastic, and braced the damaged window from inside. Every few minutes, another gust shook the building. Nora kept looking toward the journal on the table. She wanted to continue reading. Instead, she held a board while Daniel drove screws into a temporary support. "You're allowed to save the house first," he said. "I know. You're staring at that journal like it's going somewhere." Nora almost smiled. "I'm not used to having two things worth protecting at once." By morning, part of the exterior trim near the lighthouse tower had torn free, and rain had entered the second light room. Nora, Daniel, and Thomas spent hours drying the floor and covering exposed wood. The practical work exhausted her, but it also forced the mystery into the background long enough for one truth to settle. Elias had known innocent people could be harmed if the full passenger list became public. His silence had cost him his reputation, but it had bought them time to disappear into new lives. Late that afternoon, Nora found an envelope tucked between two journal pages that had stuck together from moisture. It had never been sealed. On the front, Elias had written no address, only, "To whoever one day believes I should have spoken." Inside was a single sheet. Nora read it aloud while Thomas stood beside the kitchen table. Elias wrote that he could defend himself only by naming people who had trusted him to protect them. He could tell Greyhaven exactly who survived, but doing so might send officials searching for families whose documents were incomplete or non-existent. "I will not purchase my good name with their fear," he had written. "If silence is the price, I will pay it." Nora lowered the letter. Thomas turned away, wiping at one eye before pretending to examine the damaged window. He knew what people would say about him. Nora whispered, "Yes." "And he chose it anyway." Thomas nodded. Later, Daniel returned to the second light room to check where rain had entered the wall. Nora followed with a flashlight. One section of wooden paneling had swollen noticeably from the storm. Daniel pressed it with his palm. The board shifted inward. "That's not right." He tapped along the wall. Most of it gave a solid knock. Then, behind the lamp assembly, the sound changed. Hollow. Nora stepped closer. Daniel slid the pry bar carefully beneath the damp edge of the panel. A thin line of darkness appeared behind it. He looked at Nora. "There's another space back here." Daniel held the loose panel away from the wall, while Nora aimed the flashlight into the narrow opening. Dust floated through the beam. She expected pipes, broken masonry, maybe another forgotten piece of equipment. Instead, she saw paper, bundles of it. Dozens of envelopes had been stacked carefully inside the cavity, tied with string and wrapped in waxed cloth that had darkened with age. "Letters," Nora whispered. Daniel eased the panel farther open. "Looks like someone wanted them dry." Nora reached in and lifted the first bundle. The string nearly broke between her fingers. None of the envelopes held money. None contained deeds, certificates, or anything that could explain why someone had hidden them so carefully. They were simply letters addressed to Captain Elias Whitaker. Nora carried them to the keeper's kitchen, where the table was still crowded with the journal, Samuel Bell's compass, and the photograph Elena Ferreira had sent. Thomas joined them after Daniel called him from the doorway. Nora opened the oldest letter first. It was dated 1954. The writer thanked Elias for carrying her daughter through freezing water and wrapping her in a blanket while she shook so hard she could not speak. Another came from a man who said his family had found work in Massachusetts and that his sons were finally attending school. Another described a baby born 2 years after the storm. The writer had named the child Elias. Nora read slowly, careful not to tear the fragile pages. Every letter told a different life after Blackwater. A marriage, a first home, a job in a textile mill, children graduating from school, grandchildren being born. The people who wrote them never called Elias a hero. They wrote as if they were speaking to someone who already understood the cost of survival. "Thank you for not giving our names. Thank you for letting us disappear when disappearing was what kept us together." Thank you for the light. Nora stopped reading. They knew. Thomas stood on the other side of the table, staring at the letters. They knew what he gave up. And they kept writing to him? Nora looked at the pile. Greyhaven had remembered Elias as a coward. But somewhere beyond Greyhaven, families had remembered him differently for decades. The discovery did not feel like victory. It felt private, almost painful. Elias had been thanked in kitchens and living rooms he would never see. People had raised children because of the choice that ruined his name. Daniel picked up one envelope but did not open it. He kept all of them. Nora nodded. Maybe this was the only place where he could prove to himself it mattered. Thomas looked down. Or maybe he never needed proving. Nora thought of Elias's unsent letter. I will not purchase my good name with their fear. She had believed she understood those words before. Now they carried faces, families, years. She opened another letter. The handwriting was shaky and uneven. The writer described arriving in America terrified that every knock at the door would separate the family. Elias had helped them reach friends inland without asking for anything in return. At the bottom was a line Nora read twice. Our names remain where your light brought us home. What does that mean? Daniel asked. Nora looked toward the tower. I don't know. It was the first clue in days that did not immediately fit. Not a new mystery, she reminded herself. Another part of the same one. 23 people had survived. Their official names had been erased or altered. But this letter suggested their real names had been preserved somewhere. Before Nora could examine the other bundles, tires rolled over the gravel outside. Charles Vane stepped from his sedan alone. He saw the open panel in the second light room from the doorway, and then the letters spread across the kitchen table. His face changed. Not fear exactly. Recognition. You found them, he said. Nora stood. You knew they were here. Charles removed his gloves slowly. I knew letters existed. I didn't know where. Thomas's expression hardened. Your family knew more than that. Charles looked at him. My family knew enough to keep quiet. Nora held up one of the letters. These people were real. 23 survivors. Arthur Vane carried passengers he didn't put on the manifest. Charles did not deny it. My grandfather operated that ship. He cut corners. He took money from people who had few options. After the wreck, he protected himself. Nora waited for excuses. None came. Then why are you still protecting him? She asked. Charles looked tired for the first time since she had met him. I'm not protecting Arthur. I'm protecting what came after him. My father spent his life trying to build a respectable name. I inherited businesses, employees, obligations. You reveal this publicly? People won't separate a dead man's decisions from everyone who came later. Elias didn't get that choice. Charles flinched slightly. Nora continued. He carried your grandfather's shame for more than 50 years. And exposing mine won't give his years back. No. But leaving the lie in place keeps taking them. Charles glanced at the journal, the compass, the photograph, and finally the letters. I'm not going to threaten you. Nora, I'm not going to pretend Arthur was innocent. I'm asking whether every truth has to become public. Nora thought of the newspaper headline that had survived longer than Elias's own voice. When a lie becomes history. Yes. Charles held her gaze, then nodded once. Then I suppose you'll do what you think is right. He left without mentioning the property offer, after his car disappeared. Nora returned to the letters. The exchange had left her hands shaking, though she could not decide whether from anger or relief. Thomas sat beside her. You did better than I would have at 18. At 18, you probably had somewhere else to live. Fair point. Daniel came in from the tower holding the letter with the line about the names. This is bothering me. He placed it beside Samuel Bell's compass. Our names remain where your light brought us home. Nora stared at the words. She pictured the hidden room, the lamp, the narrow shutter, the path through the rocks. Where your light brought us home, she repeated. Thomas went very still. Nora noticed immediately. What? He rubbed his forehead. Something my father used to say. I haven't thought about it in years. What did he say? Thomas looked toward the tower entrance. Whenever I asked about that night, he'd shut me down. Once, when I asked if the people Elias helped were ever remembered, he said something strange. Nora leaned forward. Thomas's eyes remained fixed on the lighthouse. He said, Names belong behind the light. Nora was inside the second light room before Thomas finished repeating the words, Names belong behind the light. Daniel brought the pry bar, but Nora stopped him before he touched the wall. Careful, she said, if they're really there. I don't want to destroy them trying to find them. The lamp assembly stood against the seaward wall, its dull reflector facing the narrow shutter. Behind it, the wooden panels looked no different from the rest of the room, except for years of dust and salt staining. Daniel removed the screws holding the metal bracket to the wall, one at a time. Thomas steadied the lamp while Nora held the flashlight. When they shifted the assembly forward, a narrow strip of unfinished wood appeared behind it. At first, Nora saw only scratches. Then she wiped the surface with the edge of her sleeve. Letters emerged beneath the dust. A name, then another. Daniel moved the flashlight higher. The entire backside of the panel had been covered in carvings. Names ran in uneven rows across the wood, some deep and careful, others shallow as if cut by trembling hands. Besides several were dates. A few had places written underneath. Porto, Lisbon, Braga, São Miguel. Nora's throat tightened. She counted silently. How many? Thomas asked. Nora started again from the top, touching each line without pressing too hard. 23. No one spoke. She found Ana Ferreira halfway down, the letters small and crooked compared with the others. Under Anna's name was a date matching the storm. Nora reached into her pocket and pulled out Samuel Bell's compass. 23. BP. 23 people. Blackwater Point. The number had never been a code. It had been a memory. Thomas sank onto the edge of the workbench. My father knew they were here. He carried the number with him. Nora said. Daniel crouched near the lower part of the panel. There's something else. Beneath the final row of names, a single sentence had been carved in larger letters. The cuts were deeper, deliberate. Nora bent down and read it aloud. Let history blame me. Let them live. Her voice broke on the final word. She sat back on the floor. For weeks she had been trying to prove Elias Whitaker had not been a coward. Now the truth felt larger than innocence. Elias had known exactly what silence would cost him. The newspaper headline, the contempt, the isolation. Years of being remembered as the man who refused to help while others drowned. And he had chosen it because the alternative might have exposed the people he pulled from the water. Nora pressed the heel of her hand against her eyes. She had imagined discovering family as finding someone who would have claimed her. Instead, she had found a man who had given up being claimed by his own community so other families could remain together. Thomas rested a hand on her shoulder. Nora did not pull away. He could have told them, she said. He could have saved his name. Yes, and he didn't. Thomas looked at the carved names. Now you know why. By afternoon, Margaret was standing inside the second light room with a camera, archive, gloves, and a notebook. She photographed every name, every date, every mark. Then they compared the carvings to the letters found in the wall and to the records she had already gathered. Anna Ferreira matched. 2 other surnames appeared in correspondence from Massachusetts. One matched a family listed in a later immigration record. The connections multiplied slowly, but none contradicted what Elias had written. Margaret lowered her camera. "This is physical evidence tied directly to the lighthouse. Enough to change the record?" Nora asked. "Enough that the Greyhaven Historical Society can't dismiss it as family memory." Nora looked toward the lamp. "I don't want them calling him a hero if they're just replacing one simple story with another." Margaret nodded. "Then we show what happened, not what people should feel about it." 2 days later, Margaret presented copies of the journal entries, the altered manifest, Elena Ferreira's photograph, the letters, and the photographs of the 23 names to members of the Historical Society. Nora sat beside Thomas in a small meeting room above the library, listening as people who had grown up with the same story began asking different questions. No one offered an immediate apology. No one erased the old newspaper headline. But by the end of the meeting, the board voted to open a formal review of the 1952 Blackwater wreck record and preserve the second light room as evidence. Outside, Charles Vane waited near the library steps. Nora tensed when she saw him. He did not argue. "Margaret told me what you found," he said. 23 names. "Yes." Charles looked toward the harbor. "Arthur should have answered for what he did while he was alive." Nora said nothing. "I won't fight the review," he added. "It was not forgiveness." And Nora did not need it to be. She nodded once and walked past him. Back at Blackwater Point, the victory lasted less than an hour. Thomas had brought a county safety notice that had been left at his shop after an inspector reviewed the storm damage. The roof needed structural work. Sections of wiring had to be replaced. The tower stairs required reinforcement. The second light room could not be opened to anyone until the building met basic safety requirements. Nora read the estimated costs twice. "I can't pay this." Daniel leaned against the kitchen counter. "Not right now. Not ever, at this rate." The thought hit harder than she expected. She had found the truth, but the building holding it was still rotting around her. If the repairs were not made, the lighthouse could be closed completely. Nora sat at the table and pulled out her wallet. Inside, behind her identification, was the folded scrap of paper on which she had written her remaining money the day she arrived in Greyhaven. $47. She placed it beside the repair estimate. Weeks ago, $47 had been proof she had almost nothing left. Now she looked toward the tower, toward the hidden room where 23 names remained carved behind the light, and understood that losing Blackwater Point would mean losing the first place that had ever felt like hers before she was ready to leave it. The repair estimate stayed on Nora's kitchen table for 3 days. Every morning she looked at the total, then at the $47 note beside it, as if either number might change. Neither did. Thomas inspected the roof again and found no miracle hiding beneath the shingles. Daniel priced replacement wiring and returned with the same answer. Blackwater Point could be saved, but not with what Nora had. Then Margaret called, "You need to come to the library." Nora expected another document. Instead, she found Margaret surrounded by letters, printed emails, and handwritten notes. The Historical Society released a notice about the review. Margaret explained, "The story traveled farther than Greyhaven." Elena Ferreira had shared photographs of the second light with her family. Other descendants began recognizing surnames among the 23 carved names. Some had letters or photographs of their own. Others had only stories passed from parents and grandparents about a storm in Maine and a lighthouse that had shown them through the rocks. One note included $20. Another included $50. Nora stared at the envelopes. I didn't ask them for money. No, Margaret said. They asked what the lighthouse needed. Nora's first instinct was to refuse. She had survived by depending on as few people as possible. Accepting help always felt like creating a debt someone could collect later. Margaret seemed to read the hesitation. They're not rescuing you, Nora. They're preserving something that belongs to their families, too. That distinction stayed with her. The repairs began small. Thomas donated labor and persuaded suppliers to sell materials at cost. Daniel replaced dangerous wiring section by section, complaining that the lighthouse seemed personally offended by modern electricity. Margaret organized the historical documents so the originals would not be damaged. Contributions from descendants covered structural lumber and roof materials. No single donation transformed Blackwater Point. Dozens of small ones did. Nora worked beside everyone. She carried boards, scraped paint, cleaned rooms, learned to replace damaged shingles, and spent evenings answering letters from families who wanted to know whether a grandparent's name was among the 23. One cold morning, Charles Vane arrived carrying 2 cardboard archive boxes. Nora met him at the door. What are those things my family should have turned over years ago? Inside were shipping ledgers, correspondence, and business records belonging to Arthur Vane. Charles did not ask her to hide anything. Give them to Margaret, he said. Let the record be complete. Nora accepted the boxes. Thank you. Charles looked up at the tower. My grandfather spent years protecting his name. Elias spent years giving his away. He paused. History can decide which mattered more. Months later, the Greyhaven Historical Society completed its review. The official account of the 1952 wreck was amended. Elias Whitaker had participated in the rescue. Evidence supported that 23 unlisted or improperly recorded passengers had reached shore through Blackwater Point with the help of Elias. Samuel Bell and the other fishermen named in the journal, Arthur Vane's altered passenger records were included in the historical account. The old newspaper headline still existed, but it no longer stood alone. Nora attended the small public presentation with Thomas beside her. When Elias's photograph appeared, she did not feel triumph. She felt relief. Someone had finally allowed him to be complicated, frightened, brave, and human instead of reducing his life to one accusation. The lighthouse took longer to repair. By spring, the keeper's quarters had a sound roof, safe wiring, repaired windows, and one bedroom Nora could sleep in without strategically placing buckets around the floor. The tower stairs were reinforced. The second light room was preserved rather than renovated, its 23 names protected behind clear panels so visitors could see the original wood. The journal went into a climate-controlled display case with copies available for researchers. Nora received another offer to sell the property after the story gained attention. The amount was larger than Charles's original offer. She folded the letter and put it away. She no longer needed to think about the answer. One afternoon, Daniel was repairing the final exterior fixture while Nora painted the keeper's doorway. So, he said, what happens when this place is finished? Nora looked at him. You find something else to complain about? I mean, you... He climbed down the ladder. How long are you staying in Greyhaven? Months earlier, Nora would have answered automatically, until the car works, until I find a job, until I save enough, until I can leave. Every place in her life had been temporary. So she had learned to leave emotionally before anyone could make her leave physically. She looked through the open doorway at the small kitchen where Thomas drank coffee most mornings without asking permission. At the repaired window Daniel had helped board during the storm. And beyond them at the tower where Elias's journal had waited beneath the stairs. I think I'm already home, she said. Daniel smiled. Took you long enough. On the evening Blackwater Point officially reopened, descendants of several survivors gathered outside with Greyhaven residents. Elena Ferreira came from Massachusetts and stood silently before her mother's carved name. Thomas carried Samuel Bell's compass in his pocket. Margaret watched visitors enter the historical room one at a time, reminding everyone not to touch the wood. Nora stayed near the journal display until the crowd thinned. Elias's handwriting lay beneath the glass, open to the entry about the approaching storm. She thought about the metal box beneath the stairs and how close she had come to leaving it there. Then she returned to the keeper's quarters and opened a new blank journal. From her wallet, she removed the old scrap of paper she had kept since arriving in Greyhaven. $47. She placed it inside the back cover, then turned to the first page. I came here because I had nowhere else to go. Nora paused, listening to the sea beyond the window. Then she added, I stayed because someone before me left a light on. Outside. Darkness had settled over Blackwater Point. Nora walked to the tower with Thomas and Daniel. The restored main lamp came alive first, sweeping its beam across the Atlantic. Then Daniel handed Nora the switch for the smaller system below. For more than half a century, the second light had remained dark. Nora pressed the switch. A warm beam passed through the narrow shutter and reached toward the channel between the rocks. Behind it, preserved beneath clear panels, were 23 names. The light no longer needed to guide frightened families through a storm. It existed now because they had survived one. Nora stepped outside and stood beside the keeper's house. The wind carried salt across the point, but the roof no longer rattled, and the windows no longer trembled in broken frames. At 18, she had arrived with a dead car, one duffel bag, $47, and nowhere else to sleep. She had believed the lighthouse was valuable because nobody could make her leave it. She understood now that home meant something different. It was not simply a place that belonged to her, it was a place where she had finally allowed herself to belong. Behind her stood the house. Above her turned the lighthouse beam. Below it burned the smaller light Elias had once used to bring 23 people through the rocks. Nora watched both lights move across the darkness and listened to the steady ocean. Blackwater Point had been forgotten for decades, just as Elias's truth had been forgotten, and Nora had sometimes feared she could be forgotten too. But some things survived neglect. A journal beneath a staircase, letters behind a wall, names carved where no one thought to look, and sometimes, Nora realized, the places the world abandoned were the very places that remembered what mattered most.